Test 1, 2, 3. Test 1, 2, 3. All right. Welcome to the February Springfield AWS user group. Tonight we're going to talk about CloudFormation. Like I was saying earlier, this is going to be an introductory talk. We'll cover basic concepts and why you would use CloudFormation, and then we'll get into a demonstration of, we'll dig into a code example that's out on GitHub that I shared last month, and how it works and why it works, and then I'll field questions. So let's get started. Concepts, we're going to go through these different items. We're going to talk about the benefits of CloudFormation, features, pricing, basic templating, deploying and updating, and then Q&A. Since not a lot of you have used CloudFormation, the gist of it is that you would use code to provision your infrastructure. So let's say you need to roll out a couple of servers, and then all of a sudden they're in testing, and you want to roll the same servers out in production. Rather than going and looking at your settings in your control panel or through the command line interface, you can literally copy and paste code or deploy the exact same code as essentially a separate stack that they call it, and then you would have two completely isolated, siloed off instances of your infrastructure. Now, when I first got into CloudFormation, one of the struggles for me, a lot like a sysadmin struggle naming anything, you get hung up on stuff that probably doesn't matter. I found out that you can write the code in YAML or JSON. I'm like, well, I know what both of them are, but why would I use one or the other? The code examples are a mixed bag. You'll look at the examples. They'll usually have the code examples in YAML and JSON. Sometimes they'll have them in one or the other, and so it's not really clear which direction you should go. Honestly, the folks that I've talked to that use a lot of CloudFormation use YAML specifically because it allows commenting in the code. So that sold me. Other than that, I had gone back and forth at first, and both worked perfectly fine. I could usually find code examples for either language. Converting from one to the other is doable, but not something that I'd wish on folks on a regular basis. So usually you'd go with one and stick with it. And from when you look at the code here in a little bit, and I'll pop over to some code here that we're going to look at a little bit later. This code is out in the SGF AWS GitHub account. It's rolling out some static sites, and you can see where it even allows us to format the code a little bit. So that's essentially just one long comment, but it breaks up the code a little bit, makes it look a little bit nicer. In this particular case, you have some comments as far as do I need to use this? I mean, that's perfect example of something that I'd look back at later and go, oh yeah, we were trying to figure out if we needed to set cache control there. But anyway, as far as CloudFormation benefits, besides the obvious fact that you're using code to provision your infrastructure, you're able to automate your deployments. You can automate scaling as well. So think if you start out with a server, but you've designed an application that can be scaled into multiple servers, instead of having to scale horizontally, you're scaling vertically. Wait, do I have that backwards? You're scaling to multiple servers, right? Every time you add a new server, AWS needs to know what that configuration looks like, what that build looks like, and by using CloudFormation, the number of servers that you're rolling out initially, and even your max and min servers can end up essentially being variables. You plug that in when you roll out your stack. If you want to change those settings later, you can go back and edit your stack. We're going to bump over to the AWS console for just a moment so I can show you, give you a brief introduction to that. We're going to hit on this a little bit more. But I logged into the AWS console, went to Services, CloudFormation, and then I landed here on this page. If you drill down, if I go and tell it that I want to update the stack, I guess let me back up a second. This particular account has two CloudFormation stacks. This stack gives you is managing some DNS settings. This stack is rolling out some servers. And when I drill down into a stack, I can view the status of the stack. I can update the stack, and like I was saying, it allows you to deploy code. On the next page, I'll have some variables that I can plug in, and these variables, you can set variables just like you would in any other software project. Now, another benefit, a huge benefit of this, especially for us, is that when we roll out our infrastructure with CloudFormation, every time our template changes, we commit those changes to source control just like we would commit any other code changes. So if we need to roll back to a certain version of our project, we can roll back to a certain version of our application code and a certain version of our infrastructure, which is pretty handy. Or if all of a sudden we realize by analyzing logs that some sort of performance issue was introduced at a certain point, we can go back to our deployment logs and figure out exactly what code or infrastructure was deployed. That used to be limited to analyzing the code that was deployed, but now with this, you can look at, okay, did I change a setting on a server somewhere, or did I change something with my load balancer that's causing this problem? It can be super handy to see that in your IDE or whatever you use to manage your Git repository. And then finally, as far as benefits go, Amazon recognizes that this will make your life a lot easier and you'll be more inclined to use more of their services, so that they do not charge an extra fee for CloudFormation. They only charge for the resources that you roll out with CloudFormation. So that's icing on the cake, I suppose. Any questions before we dig into features? Okay. If you have any questions, you're welcome to interrupt. It's not a problem. On the feature side of things, these are probably the top 5 features, and I can speak to the first 3, but if the other 2 interest you, I want you to be aware of them, and that's something you need to read up on. I can give you a brief description of each. Safety controls are essentially preventing your infrastructure from like accidentally deleting infrastructure, for example. You can set some safety controls there. You can also set some monitoring to where when you're rolling out your CloudFormation change set, and we'll demonstrate this in a little bit, but you can make changes to your CloudFormation code. You can upload that change to the stack that I showed you a minute ago, and it will recognize that it'll calculate the difference between what you already have and your new code, and then it will basically warn you of things that are human error. A lot of different things like, well, the new code doesn't have this that you need or whatever. It does a really good job of warning you if there's a problem with your infrastructure code. Yes, Tom?
Have you had any trouble with CloudFormation not recognizing a change? What we've had to do, we have a mix of, we use CloudFormation for the AppSync stuff.
Okay.
We use Terraform for everything else.
Okay.
So we have like a subroutine in Terraform.
Sure.
That calls CloudFormation, and every time we run CloudFormation, we have to do a full replace.
Really?
Where it tears down the old CloudFormation and rebuilds a new CloudFormation. Because when we were doing an update, and this might be particular to AppSync, I'm not sure.
Maybe.
But it would not respond, and it might be the way that we were doing it.
Okay.
I can get into the details of that maybe outside of this talk.
Sure.
But have you had any of that trouble? It can always tell that, oh, it's shifted, so I just need to do this update.
Yes.
Targeted.
Yes, with the services that we use, but the question was whether or not we've had problems with CloudFormation failing to recognize change sets, specifically with AppSync, since that's what you guys are using. We're not using AppSync, and we haven't experienced it with other services like S3 or EC2 or CloudFront or Route
we've
53.
exclusively used it
So
for
I'm
AppSync, so it might
wondering if
be
it's specific to that. But I am sure, regardless of whether it's specific to that or not, I'm sure that's not by design. And if they were aware of it, they'd probably be able to help track down what the problem is.
Yeah.
And we've found for those edge cases where something just doesn't seem to work like it's supposed to, Amazon support has been stellar in pinpointing the issue. Once in a while it's us, once in a while it's them, but we rarely use their support. But when we do, they really come through. So I would open a ticket with them and have them help you out. They're really good about that, especially since it sounds like it could be an issue with the service. So as far as the change sets, we were just talking about change sets. This also lets you upload the new version of your code or your infrastructure code, and it'll calculate those change sets for you and show you exactly what is going to be added or removed or replaced, which is really handy if you go to apply a change and you preview the change set and realize that there's a problem with your code that's causing it to maybe drop and recreate a production database. You certainly don't want that to happen. So it gives you the ability to understand, or essentially run a dry run and understand what's going to happen before you apply the change, which is very helpful, even more so when you're new to it, because it helps you understand how the code works, but definitely something to keep an eye on every time you're running change sets in production, because every once in a while you'll have some unexpected change. Then the third major feature, in my opinion, would be automatic dependency management. And that means you don't necessarily need... how many of you have ever used something like Chef or Salt to manage servers? Any type of server automation code? Typically, before we were using CloudFormation, anytime we were building out servers, we would need to be sure to say whether it's something on the server or orchestration between the servers, that this component relies on this component. So this server must be built before this server, this service must be available before this service, and every once in a while we have to give those type of hints to CloudFormation, but for the most part it just knows. It understands that you need, let's say, the web balancer needs to be built before the listeners can be built, and things like that. So you don't have to explicitly say, build this first and then build this. It knows that it depends on the other. And then CloudFormation can, I'm going to mention these because I'm aware of them, but I don't have a lot of experience with them. CloudFormation can be used across accounts and across regions. So if you are in a situation where a lot of organizations will have one master account for billing, and then they'll have separate accounts for maybe different departments, or for production and staging and testing, or what have you. You can apply your CloudFormation stacks using StackSets across all of those accounts. If you're not already doing that, chat with me afterwards, because I'd love to hear your use case that doesn't require multiple accounts, or help fill you in on some of the reasons to look at that, because it is pretty powerful and helps with a lot of different management and security type issues. On the pricing side, like I said, you only pay for the resources you deploy. There are no additional charges for CloudFormation itself. So let's get into some template basics. Now I'm going to hop back and forth between the slides and the code. We've already talked about the difference between YAML and JSON. So we'll talk, I'm going to introduce you to the structure of the files so that you know when you're looking at your first CloudFormation files what you're looking at. But essentially you have parameters, resources, and outputs. There are some other sections that come into the mix, but as far as getting started, those are some good pieces to be familiar with. So I'm gonna come back up to the top, but I'm gonna scroll through this and I'm gonna show you have your parameters, and then this is indented to where these are all of my parameters. You have your resources. This is essentially what's being built, and we're going to look at this in a little bit more detail. We won't look at every single item, but then finally you have your outputs. And so with this example, static sites, it's outputting a domain name, a redirect bucket, and so on and so forth. And you can see these outputs when we're in CloudFormation and we go to our stacks. if we click on our static sites, we can expand outputs. And these are essentially the variables that we had set there. I'm going to go back to the file and talk more about how these are calculated, but I want to point out that it's really handy to be able to pass outputs from your file, because you can also have CloudFormation files call other CloudFormation files, and so they can essentially read the outputs from those child files. Let's go back to this though, and let's go back up to the parameters. And I'm going to just look at a couple of these, and then I'm going to show you what they look like on the AWS side. So, for example, the parameters are asking the end user for inputs. And this gives you some flexibility in your files. When you build your first file, it may have no parameter, it may have no output, it might just create a bucket. Or it might just create one server and be done. But as you become more comfortable with CloudFormation files, you'll find that the parameters are really powerful in making files reusable. So I can essentially add drop-downs for different things and end up with a file that I can deploy to production or to development. I can also, this is, if we were deploying servers, on the development servers, the drop-down might allow you to choose the instance size. So you might choose something like a T2 or T3 micro if it's something small that you're just testing, but then in production it might be deployed to an M4 and M5. Yes, question?
So the parameters and output, that's almost like running a function where you're specifying the inputs that are going to go into the resources you're creating in the body of the script, and then the output is the results, what you want to see having been created.
Yeah, that's a great way to look at it. You're exactly right. You can think of the parameters as inputs for a function, and then the outputs as the outputs of the function. I can't argue with that at all. I hadn't heard of it put that way before, but that's a great way of thinking of it. So let's see here. Before we move on, I'm going to dig into this file a little bit. You're always going to have a header. The template header, the template version has to do with what features are and what syntax is available. If you see an example and it's pinned to a specific version, my recommendation is, if you're using that example it's in its entirety, to probably stick with whatever version is in the example. In case something has changed along the line, what you can run into is if you use an example that's a bit older and you plug in the latest version and something's changed, you might spend some time trying to troubleshoot an issue that you could have avoided. Now, if you get to a point where you're building these regularly and you're really comfortable with them, then I would recommend using a later version. This particular code that I'm showing you was based on an example, and so I stuck with that version. But then you have a description, which the resources for hosting static websites. You can see that right here. So when you're looking at your stacks, it gives you some idea of what each of these are, and I'm zoomed in quite a bit, but you can see when you're looking at it at a more normal resolution, that can be pretty handy because the end user has full control over what they name their stacks. So if the stacks have funky names or aren't super helpful, it's nice to at least be able to look at the description and see what the stack's all about. So I highly recommend that you have a fairly short but informative description. And then in this particular case, I'm going to download and run this. Raw, save, so that you can see what this looks like in action. But you'll see that when we run this, that this is building out some CloudFront resources and is asking us for a price class. And let's look at this. I'm going to jump into the AWS console, and I'm going to go to CloudFront and start to build out a resource so you can see the parallels here. And while I'm waiting for that to load, I'm going to create a new stack, and I'm going to choose the file that we just downloaded here. And when you're doing this, you're presented with the option to design a template using their GUI. I have had people go into the GUI and drag like S3 bucket, an EC2 server, and a couple other things into the thing, and they thought they were done, and they'd send me the file, and it was blank, only it had like an S3 bucket with no name, and like, if you run it, nothing happened, was my point. So don't be deceived if you go and look at this and think, oh wow, this is really easy. There's a little bit more to it than just dragging resources into the map. It can be useful when you're getting started, but I don't know anybody that uses it a whole lot. Most people are just, once you get the hang of the file format, most people I know prefer the file format, because the other issue with the design template is, let's say you pull in a template, make some changes to it, you write it out. At least from my experience, it tends to rewrite the whole thing in a random order every time, so that kills the idea of being able to commit it to a code repository. So anyway, if they have a bunch of samples here that you could choose from if we were going to use one of their samples, and they've got some really nice examples. If you're new to this and want to experiment, I recommend you do. You could potentially upload your template to S3 and paste the URL, but by uploading it through this interface, it's being dropped into an S3 bucket, and I'll show you where that is, just so that you are aware of it and don't delete that bucket when it shows up. We only have a few buckets in this account, and the bucket will be prefixed with CF for CloudFormation. And I was hoping that I'd be able to, it hasn't uploaded it yet. But anyway, if you see buckets prefixed with CF templates, be aware that those were likely generated by CloudFormation and are being used. So don't delete them.
You can't just drop. You can't just like do the console drop your YAML into that bucket and then expect the stack to run or anything.
No, if you drop your YAML file into that S3 bucket, nothing will happen. I mean, it'll certainly get uploaded to the bucket, but CloudFormation isn't going to know to do anything with it. Now, you could certainly build out some sort of code, and I'm sure there's an example out there where, for example, our production systems, every time a new file lands in an S3 bucket, S3 sends an SNS, a simple notification, onto something else that executes and does something with that. I would almost guarantee that there's some sort of Lambda function that could receive those notifications and then basically start a CloudFormation job if it needed to. So if you didn't have any parameters, or somehow your Lambda function was hard-coded with the parameters that needed to be passed to the CloudFormation template, or the CloudFormation template had defaults and Lambda could just be told, the function could be told to run it with the defaults, I imagine you could do something like that. But no, you can't just drag it to the S3 bucket and have it show up in, say, the sample template list or anywhere here, or have it automatically deployed. But we're going to click Next, and by clicking Next, it was uploaded to that bucket. So now you can see this file from February 12th, and we can give it a name. So we're going to call it we'll call it AWS demo. Super specific, right? And now you can see these inputs, or the different parameters. Like this is your CloudFront price class, and it's defaulting to 100. Let's create a CloudFront distribution. I'm not going to go through the whole step, but we're creating a web distribution. And I'm just going to show you these parameters on this page. Here's your price class. When we were looking at it a moment ago, our options were 100, 200, and all. And when you look at this, you can see use only these, or use all. And you can imagine that somehow these map to the other. But you're going to find that if you're used to building things in the web interface, you're occasionally going to have to go over to the documentation to figure out what the values are, since you're not going to put use only US, Canada, and Europe as a parameter. It wouldn't recognize that. And so if I were doing that, I would search for CloudFormation, CloudFront, and then their docs are usually well indexed to where I can scroll down and I can look at the different values, and if I know exactly what I'm looking for, I can even search for it. But they should have, well, we'll search for that specific parameter to make it to the right page here. Here we go. Create distribution. That's what we want. So now in this particular case, the price class, that's why I'm confused here. So we're basically asking in our parameters for a value, and we give 3 choices, and we have a default, and we're naming that value CloudFront price class. If you search the document for that value a little bit further down, you can see where it's being used in the first resource. The resource has a name, but the type, which is what we would have searched for when we're searching for the documentation, is AWS CloudFront distribution, and we're creating a distribution. Anyway, now you'll notice when you look at the documentation, it still doesn't tell you exactly what the 3 are, but you can drill down into other documentation that will explain what the different price classes are, and I believe at some point it will map them. But I mean, 100, 200, and all, I was able to assume that 100 was the US only and 200 was the middle ground, and then all. So on the parameter side, then there are some other things that can be overridden here. I'll go ahead and deploy this and let it run just so you can get a feel for how long this can take. CloudFront is very quick for some resources and very slow for others. This is an example of where it's not quick. We'll call this site 2, redirect 2, and secondary 2. I'm not going to be able to deploy this. I don't have the SSL certs worked out. So there are some features that we've had trouble deploying through CloudFront, and SSL certificates are one of them. And so in that case, when we're deploying this, we're having to go, how many of you are familiar with AWS SSL? How many of you have ever used their SSL product? Well, then, since there's no one here that has, I'm going to jump into that as an aside, just because we've been pretty impressed with it. I mean, this is just the user group account, so you're not going to see a lot of action here, but you can go in and request free certs, much like you would with Let's Encrypt or the certbot tools, and they manage them. They don't charge you anything for them. So it's a free service. It's auto-renewed, and if you host your DNS with Route 53, it's a single-click confirmation too. So I'm going to roll through this very quickly, just so that you can see what that looks like, and then we'll have the value that we need to plug in here. So I'm going to close S3. I'm going to tell it that our primary name is this. Oh, no, we need a redirect cert, so I'm going to tell it it's this. Next, I'm going to tell it we want to validate the SSL with DNS, and I'm going to confirm and request. And now it's going to give us a couple different options. We can plug some entries into our DNS, or we can just create the record in Route 53, and by the time we come back and refresh this, it will be ready to go. So while we're waiting for that, I'm going to request the second one that I need. We'll call that secondary 2. And I'm willing to go through this because it is so fast. it used to be that you had to order certs and wait for them to be issued and things like that. We're creating the record in Route 53, and now I wouldn't be surprised if by the time I go back to look at the first one, it's already been issued. It's still pending, but they literally only take a minute or two. I'm always impressed with how quickly they're issued. And as soon as they're issued, I'll be able to pull the the values that I need from right here. Let me make sure. It's saying it wants the ARN of the SSL certificate, and I can essentially copy and paste the value once they're issued, and the CloudFormation template will know to use it. Well, okay. One's already, and the other one will be ready in just a moment. Let's see. So we'll copy redirect in here. And with this being a live demo, it might fail on us, but I want you to get a feel for what it looks like when you go through the steps. Because I haven't looked at this template for a month, so I'm hoping that it doesn't need some funky setting on those SSL certs. All right, so I'm going to copy that ARN into there, and now it knows how to find those two SSL certs when it builds out the CloudFront stuff. And then you have the option to tag all of your resources. So if I wanted to say domain, and then something like SGF AWS.org or customer, everybody has a little bit different naming scheme, but it's really helpful to tag everything with some sort of scheme so that you can break down your cost when it comes to billing. We don't need to set any of these other options. Generally, I think you'll find that you don't until you get into more advanced use cases.
Sorry, can you go back again? The tag you're just doing?
Sure. Yeah, I can go to tagging on one of these others while that's running.
What are you tagging?
All of the resources that are created by this template end up with that tag. So let's look at this. I don't think I used any tags on this. Okay, domain, for some reason, MissouriState.edu. So if I look at any of these, because this was a demo for them, all of the resources tied to this template should include that tag, a domain, MissouriState.edu. So let's just look at a resource, and we'll see what we've got here. We're going to go back to the CloudFront page, and you can see that it's creating several CloudFront distributions, and that is the hang up on this particular template, because it just takes like 20 minutes to do it. I mean, there's no real way around it. So that's why I picked something that was already built in this account so that you could see what it looked like even if that didn't finish in time. But if we drill down into one of these and we look at the tags, you'll see that it's, that's strange. I picked a poor tag choice because it overwrote the tag with the domain for the distribution in this case. But we can look at something else that was created by that. So that brings up a good point. When you're using tags and choosing tags, you probably ought to find tags that aren't reserved words. I was doing this as a demo, so I didn't even think of that. People use things like customer or stack or environment, different things like that.
How would you know what the reserved words are?
I believe there's a list. I can look that up and send it out to everybody. It's something I should know anyway. I'm going to jot that down. All right. Good question, though. Let's go. I'm going to look at this code and see what else is being created. So resource-wise, it's creating this distribution. It's also creating an IAM. Okay, it's creating an S3 bucket. So we can look at the bucket, and the bucket should show the domain.
They had an option a while ago to create an IAM or use an IAM when you started the cloud.
Yeah, if you want all of this to run as a certain user instead of your current user, you can specify that on that page. So if, let's say you're logged in as some sort of special admin account, but you want that stack to be limited to a different sort of scope, you can specify a different IAM user that maybe only has access to create the resources that that CloudFormation template needs to create.
That's for the execution of the CloudFormation, not
Correct.
the actual IAM on the formation itself.
Correct, because the formation itself, you can define what the different resources have access to, and your the question was, when you are building out the CloudFormation stack and it asks about the IAM user, what does that do? And it does give CloudFormation access to build things in your account. But when you're looking at your CloudFormation code, pretty much all the time you're going to see, let's say you're rolling out EC2 servers, you'll see the CloudFormation code define an IAM role and then tie the server to that role. And so
those are unrelated.
they are, because whatever you specify needs to be able to create the server and it needs to be able to create the role. But once the thing's built, it's not used.
Okay.
Great question, though. Yeah, I sort of glazed over that since everybody's new to it. But and generally we haven't had to use that because we log into accounts that already have limited access, and then we only log into the master accounts if we really need them. So it hasn't come up a lot, but it's a great question, and it's probably something we should use too. So let's look for the bucket that it created, and since there are a bunch of buckets, we're going to go and look at our outputs to see what those buckets are. I'm closing the certificate manager since those certificates were already issued. I'm looking at my outputs to see what these bucket names look like. Static site redirect bucket. And so it would have created one of these buckets. If we go and drill down and look at their properties, the tags should include, well, no, it's overriding it with the domain of the bucket. So yeah, the domain tag that I used when I built the stack was a poor example. But that's what it's intended for.
In a way, it brought up an interesting
Yes.
point that we might have missed.
But it is supposed to apply the tags to any resources that will accept tags. So then that way, it's if you know that all of the resources being built by this particular stack need to be tagged a certain way, they're for a certain customer, or their development, or their production, or what have you, you can add the appropriate tags to them and then look at your billing and monitoring and such accordingly. Now let's look and see how this stack is doing. It's still showing create in progress, and we can look at there are no outputs because it's still in the works. We can look at our resources and see where it's hung up, and it's building both of these CloudFront distributions, so that's to be expected. While we're waiting for that, let's keep going down the list here. It's building these buckets. It's building, and let's see if there's anything interesting to mention when it's building these buckets. It's able to
What's the join syntax there on the resource?
Okay, that's a great question. So, how many of you are familiar with coding in any language at all, whether it be Bash or Python or JavaScript or anything? So, when you concatenate strings, you normally would use a dot or a plus or something like that. They don't have that in YAML. So, when you're referencing redirect bucket, it's finding redirect bucket up above, and it's pulling that value in. And then when you're joining, you're essentially concatenating these three values. I don't know if you could see that. Okay, I'll zoom in a little bit. You're concatenating this string, and then the name of the redirect bucket, and then you're adding this /* to the end. And by doing that, you're able to create a bucket policy with the full ARN path. And this first parameter to join is telling it if you want to use a specific string in between each, or like some people might need to put a dot in between, so that would be a dot, or maybe a dash or a comma. but in our case, we just want to concatenate the strings directly. So that's a great question. And you'll find you'll use that a lot. I haven't found a better way to do that, and most examples show the same thing, so you can see it here again, here again. Let's see. So we're creating the other CloudFront distribution, creating more buckets. I'm going to jump over to another script while we're waiting for that. This one creates some DNS resources. You can see it has the same headers. A difference here is that it has a metadata section that I didn't mention before, but then it's still followed by parameters, resources, outputs. The metadata section comes in handy. You'll find if you end up wanting to get real fancy with your parameters and you want them to be shown in a certain way, sorted in a certain way, you can use the metadata section to basically group your parameters and order your parameters. So let's see. In this case, we have a parameter called hosted zone domain name. The pretty name for that is hosted zone name with spaces. We have a parameter group, and I'm able by grouping these parameters, I'm able to list them in a specific order. Otherwise, they're always listed alphabetically, which if you only have 2 or 3 parameters, works out fine. But if you get into some of these a little bit more complicated ones where you like to be able to override a dozen different settings, it's not real clear what goes with what unless you group them. But going down to the resources, the DNS, these health checks are nice and simple. How many of you have used Route 53, the DNS service? Okay, a few of you. It's basically AWS managed DNS. It's a lot like any other DNS, except they have some pretty neat AWS specific features that allow you to integrate it with the rest of your services. They also have a concept of health checks, and with this particular example, we're setting up a health check that is going out to a website and checking to make sure that it can access the website over HTTPS. If it can, great, the health check passes. If it can't, it fails. And then further down, when we create our record set, we're basically using an existing zone in this case. We're naming the record with whatever primary domain name our template is using, whatever parameter we'd provided or input we'd provided. We're pointing it to this domain name, and then we're configuring our health check. So we're able to automatically read the health check ID by referencing active health check up above. It's smart enough that this is where the dependency piece comes in. You don't have to say build the health check first. It just knows, okay, they referenced the health check down here when they're building the record set, and it'll automatically figure out the ID from by referencing the health check above.
Does it matter how it's listed in there, even if it's below or above the...
It doesn't. Yeah, it doesn't matter if this reference is above or below the actual block. No, it can figure it out regardless. The great question, though. It just happens to be below in this case, which I could see where that question would come up, but no, not at all. Anyway, with the health check, basically what's happening here is you have a primary record set, and then you have a secondary record set. And so if you were creating this in the console, you would create 2 records that look nearly identical. They both have the same name, but they have different destinations. The primary record is basically your record when the health check is passing, and so it's pointed to the active domain. Your secondary record is what is returned when the health check is failing, and that's your passive domain name. And we talked briefly on this last month. If you end up digging into it and you want to see sort of what it looks like, you'll find that you can stick with some of the variables that are already in there. For example, let's see, on the DNS failover, we're hosting a site that, okay, the site must be down. we're hosting a site that you can toggle up or down to test those health checks. So you can make sure that this code is working. Like my interest wasn't in hosting a site and having it fail over. My interest was in making sure that CloudFormation would do its job. So I needed a site that could go up and down so that I could show, yes, when it's down, this works. When it's up, it's serving the right site. So you just click change page status. Here, you can't really see it there. Change page status to OK. And now here in a little bit, it will realize, the health check will realize that it's healthy. And that's public. Other people are welcome to use that. The code's published in our GitHub account if you want to launch your own. As you can see, that's still building. Where were we here? Looking at some of these parameters. Let's jump down to the bottom. Now, the outputs are referenced the same way. We just talked about referencing items above. Like, for example, primary domain name, I'm referencing primary domain name. And if you search for that, you can see that that's not a very helpful one, because you can see that your output is essentially passing an input, which can be handy if you want to be sure that you know what that name is. But let's go back to our other code that we're still waiting to build, the static sites code. And let's go down to those outputs, because they're going to be a little bit more interesting. You see the same one here that we just looked at. It's referencing an input. And you can reference with or without the quotes. If it's a single string without special characters or spaces, you don't need the quotes. Now, we can redirect the name of a bucket, for example. My copy-paste foo is failing me. You'd think that that'd be under control here. And you can see redirect bucket is the name of an S3 bucket resource. So it's creating a bucket, and when we look at that output down here, it's returning the name of that bucket. That's not a URL to the bucket, that's the actual name that you'd see when you list your buckets. If you wanted to redirect something a little bit more helpful, for example, let's look at the CloudFront endpoint, because S3 would work in a similar way. If we want to see the domain name of the CloudFront endpoint, we can get an attribute from this resource called domain name. So if I search for that and go up here, redirect CloudFront distribution is a resource that creates a CloudFront distribution. And I don't want to know the name of the CloudFront distribution, because that's not going to help me. I want, in this case, I want to know the domain name that's returned. So that's pretty handy, and you'll see that that syntax is essentially name of your resource and the name of the parameter that you're wanting to grab. Let's see. Let me hit my slides, because since we're running low on time, and make sure I'm not missing anything. I know we've talked about deploying, and then there's updating and deleting. I would like to hit on that a little bit. Let's see if doesn't look like it's done yet. So I'm going to make a change to one of these other pieces and do an update, just so that you can see what that might look like. Let's update our code. Let's see. I don't have an ID open or anything. We'll just walk through it real quick and pretend like we've updated our code. So I'll go to this existing resource. I'm going to update the stack, and I'm going to browse to this YAML file that we've used for the other stack. Honestly, there's probably not a difference between the two, but we're going to pretend like there is and see what it tells us. If I've made changes to the code, we'll find out that there's a difference. It's automatically pulling in the settings from before, so you don't have to re-enter the parameters every time. It remembers the parameters for the stack, which is important to know. It also remembers these tags, where I poorly chose the domain tag. This would be a great change set. Customer And we'll plug in a value for a new tag, and we'll leave the rest as is. Now, it does give us the option to set up notifications for changes and such. We're not going to do that here. It's calculating our changes so that we can preview them before we approve. It's showing that it's going to I bet it's going to add tags to these buckets. We can view the change set details to be sure. Let's zoom in a little bit so you guys can see it too. It's not replacing the bucket. And if you spot it before I do, you're welcome to speak up. But yeah, it's changing the tags. So maybe in this case, it's only able to change the tags on the S3 bucket, because I would have expected it to tag CloudFront as well. But we're going to let it go ahead and do that. So we'll execute. Are you sure? Yes. And since that change is pretty trivial, you'll see it's updating the static sites stack, and it's still creating our demo stack. But it'll only take a few moments, and this static site stack will be updated. We can look at our events if we want to monitor this in real time. And when we refresh, it should automatically give us progress reports. But if we look at the dates here, these are old changes from January 3rd. These are current changes from today, and it's currently running the update on our stack, and it's updating these two buckets. So now it's showing some updates are complete. Okay, and so the way you would read this is if it can run changes in parallel, like it did with these two buckets, it's updating the tags on both simultaneously, and then they both happen to finish at the same time, and then it was able to clean up, perform some cleanup on the stack and mark the stack complete. But if you have things that can run in parallel, you'll see it running them in parallel. Don't let that confuse you, though, because you may see things where 5 things start right up front, and then 3 things finish, and 2 other things are running, and it can get a little bit lost in the mix like spaghetti code. All right. So updating, I was hoping it'd be finished so I could delete. I'm not going to delete that other demo. There's not really a whole lot to it, but the main thing that I would want to show is the fact that it does a great job of cleaning up after itself. I mean, it really does. It's nice to tag things just in case it misses something, but it's pretty rare, and there are some edge cases where it'll create something that it's not going to delete, or maybe you've set up the template in such a way that it will create it, but it will never delete it. But yeah, question?
So can you make that updating and deleting? I know you're doing that in the UI, but can you make that a part of the CloudFormation script itself? Is it an existing resource you want to update as a part of the deployment?
Repeat the question, sorry.
If I have like an existing resource, like an EC2 instance that's already running, and I know it's always running when I run this CloudFormation template,
Yeah.
and I want to modify something about it, is that something I can make a part of the template as well? Or part of that deployment?
Yeah. So if you have, let's say, an existing resource like an EC2 instance and you want to change something, let's say you just want to change the tags, you could certainly do that with a CloudFormation template without shutting down the EC2 instance. Does that answer your question? Or
Sort of. So like if sort of answers my question. Yeah. If you want to force that EC2 instance to get shut down and recreated, you can do that too. But let's chat afterwards, and I'd be glad to try to make sure I understand it, because I'm missing something. I can tell I'm not answering your question. Sorry. That's all right.
All right. Gonna just check the status of this. It's probably still creating. If you want to stick around and watch me delete it afterwards, you're welcome to. I'll hang out here for a little bit, but we'll probably talk more about CloudFront in the next few months. Next month, we're going to be talking about Terraform and how it compares to CloudFormation. And David from
WWT will be presenting that. I might not be here, but we'll make sure that you have plenty of carb pizza and such. I don't know. We'll see what we can do about food for next month, but we'll definitely have something for you guys. And with that,
Jason,
yeah,
there's a question.
sure. I'm just closing off the